Most people know fragments of history dates, kings, battles, but not why the world looks the way it does today. The problem is that history feels like a list of random events. This video will solve that by showing how a few powerful turning points completely redirected the course of humanity. Once you see them together, history stops being random and starts making sense. History is full of wars, revolutions, discoveries, and empires, but only a handful of moments truly changed the direction of our world forever. These turning points reshaped nations, rewrote cultures, and set humanity on paths that still affect us today. In this video, we'll uncover the decisive moments when the world pivoted and nothing was ever the same again. Imagine a city that stood as the gateway between East and West, a place where Europe and Asia touched hands, where cultures mixed, where treasures from the Silk Road flowed in, and where Christianity and Islam stared at one another across towering walls. That city was Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, a fortress so legendary that for 1,000 years it stood defiant against invaders. Its walls had withstood crusaders, Arabs, and countless enemies, earning it a reputation of being impenetrable. And yet, in 1453, this city, this last bastion of the Roman world, fell. The fall of Constantinople was not just the end of an empire. It was a turning point that reshaped the map of the world and sent humanity hurtling into a new age. To understand why this moment changed everything, you have to imagine the Byzantine Empire in its final days. Once mighty, it had shrunk into little more than Constantinople itself, a shadow of its former self, surrounded by rising Ottoman power. By the mid-15th century, the Ottomans, under the young and ambitious Sultan Mehmed II, had already swallowed much of Byzantine territory. Mehmed, only 21 years old, was determined to take what emperors before him could not. For him, Constantinople was more than just a city. It was the heart of a dream, his dream of building a new empire that would rival Rome itself. In April 1453, Mehmed brought his army of nearly 80,000 soldiers to the city's gates. The Byzantines, led by Emperor Constantine XI, could barely gather 7,000 defenders, including a few desperate allies from Venice and Genoa. On paper, it was hopeless. But Constantinople's walls were legendary 3 layers, thick, stretching miles long, and reinforced by centuries of engineering. For a moment, it looked like the city might hold as it always had, but this was no ordinary siege. Mehmed had a secret weapon: cannons. Massive bronze cannons designed by the Hungarian engineer Orban, capable of hurling 600-pound stone balls against the walls. For weeks, the city trembled under the thunder of artillery, a sound that symbolized the dawn of a new era in warfare. No longer would great walls guarantee safety. The age of gunpowder had begun. Day after day, the defenders patched the walls, prayed in the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, and hoped for reinforcements from the West, but Europe, fractured and weary, turned its back. The Renaissance was already blooming in Italy, but few seemed to realize that the fate of Constantinople was the fate of all Christendom. When May came, so did the final assault. Ottoman forces stormed the breaches, and despite desperate resistance, the defenders were overwhelmed. Emperor Constantine XI is said to have thrown himself into battle, disappearing in the chaos, dying as the last Roman emperor. When the Ottoman banners rose above Constantinople, the world shifted. The 1,000-year-old Byzantine Empire was no more. Hagia Sophia, once the grandest church in Christendom, was converted into a mosque, symbolizing the city's transformation into Istanbul, the new Ottoman capital. For Europe, the fall was a shock. The ancient Christian stronghold that had stood since the days of Constantine the Great was gone. But perhaps the greatest ripple effect was economic. Constantinople had been Europe's link to the East, to the spices, silks, and riches of Asia. With the Ottomans controlling the trade routes, Europe suddenly found itself cut off. The prices of goods soared and frustration grew. This single event lit the fire under explorers who dreamed of finding a new way to Asia, one that bypassed Ottoman lands entirely. Within decades, men like Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama would set sail, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. Without the fall of Constantinople, the age of exploration might never have begun. Culturally, the event carried another ripple. As Byzantine scholars fled westward, they brought with them ancient Greek manuscripts and knowledge preserved for centuries. These works found their way into Italian universities, fueling the Renaissance, a rebirth of art, science, and philosophy that reshaped Europe. So while Constantinople fell, its wisdom did not die. Instead, it scattered across Europe, igniting a new era of learning. And so, in 1453, the world pivoted. One city's fall ended an empire, shifted trade, transformed warfare, inspired exploration, and fueled the Renaissance. A single moment where history bent, and the course of humanity forever changed. Close your eyes and imagine a world without factories, without railroads, without electricity. A world where the rhythm of life was dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, where most people lived in small villages, farming the land, and where handmade tools and goods were the norm. That was the reality for most of human history. For thousands of years, progress was slow and incremental. And then, in the span of just a few generations, everything changed. The Industrial Revolution was not simply a shift in technology. It was a revolution in how humans lived, worked, and thought. It was a turning point that transformed societies and laid the foundation for the modern world we inhabit today. To understand the enormity of this transformation, we must start in Britain during the late 18th century. At first glance, Britain might have seemed unremarkable compared to other great empires of the world. Yet it had the right mix of resources, wealth, and ambition to ignite a global transformation. Coal and iron lay beneath its soil. Rivers crisscrossed its lands, providing both power and transport, and its growing empire opened access to raw materials in global markets. But resources alone don't make revolutions. What mattered most was human ingenuity, a restless desire to improve efficiency and harness new power. The first sparks came in the form of machines. For centuries, cloth had been woven by hand, a slow and labor-intensive process. But inventors like James Hargreaves with his spinning jenny and later Richard Arkwright with his water frame changed everything. Suddenly, cloth could be produced at speeds unimaginable before, fueling a booming textile industry. What began as small improvements soon cascaded into a wave of innovation. The steam engine, refined by James Watt, became the heartbeat of the new age. No longer dependent on muscle power, water wheels, or wind, humanity had found a source of mechanical energy that could drive machines, pump mines, and power locomotives. The impact was immediate and unstoppable. Factories rose where cottages once stood. Entire cities grew out of the ground almost overnight. Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool became bustling industrial hubs. Families moved from rural farms into crowded towns, seeking work in the factories. Life itself shifted from the seasonal rhythms of agriculture to the relentless tick of the factory clock. The sound of machinery, the hiss of steam, and the black smoke of chimneys became the new soundtrack of civilization. But the Industrial Revolution was more than machines and factories. It reshaped society itself. Wealth poured into the hands of industrialists, creating a new class of entrepreneurs who challenged the old aristocracy. At the same time, workers toiled for long hours in dangerous conditions, sparking debates about labor rights and social justice. Child labor, unsafe factories, and overcrowded slums became stark reminders that progress carried a cost. The contrast between wealth and poverty was sharper than ever, and it forced societies to grapple with questions of fairness and reform. Transportation, too, underwent a revolution. The invention of the steam locomotive and the expansion of railroads shrank distances and brought nations closer together. Goods that once took weeks to move by horse and cart could now travel in days. Canals and later railways turned Britain into the beating heart of global trade. And across the Atlantic, the United States followed suit, building vast rail networks that would tie its expanding frontier together. The world was no longer vast and distant, it was interconnected, moving faster with every passing year. The ripple effects of this era stretched beyond industry and trade. Science and technology surged forward. New discoveries in chemistry, medicine, and engineering reshaped everyday life. Communication, too, was transformed. The telegraph allowed messages to travel instantly across continents, collapsing the gap between nations. For the first time in history, the world felt smaller, as though humanity was drawing closer together under the pulse of progress. Culturally, the Industrial Revolution challenged how people saw themselves and their place in the world. It raised questions about humanity's relationship with nature, about the dignity of labor, and about the meaning of progress itself. It inspired new political ideologies: liberalism, socialism, Marxism, as thinkers tried to make sense of the new social order. It also stirred art and literature, with writers like Charles Dickens capturing both the hope and the despair of industrial society. And yet, while it began in Britain, the revolution did not stay there. It spread like wildfire. Europe, the United States, and eventually Japan all embraced the new industrial age, each adapting it in their own way. By the 19th century, the world had been reshaped into one of machines, mass production, and global trade. Entire empires rose and fell on the back of industrial power, and wars would be fought with weapons forged in factories rather than by hand. In just over a century, the Industrial Revolution altered the human story more dramatically than almost any event before it. It marked a shift from the old world to the modern one, from hand tools to machines, from villages to cities, from slow progress to rapid innovation. It was a moment when humanity crossed a threshold it could never step back from. Forever changing the pace and direction of history, the world in 1939 was standing on the edge of a storm. Nations still carried the scars of the First World War, that war to end all wars, but the uneasy peace that followed had been fragile and full of cracks. Economic depression gripped entire populations. New ideologies were rising with terrifying intensity, and political leaders like Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and militarist generals in Japan sought to reshape the global order by force. What followed was not just another war, it was a conflict so vast, so devastating that it would touch every corner of the planet and leave humanity forever changed. When Hitler's forces invaded Poland in September of 1939, the world plunged into chaos. Within months, Nazi Germany's war machine swept across Europe, toppling governments and spreading fear. France fell, Britain braced for invasion, and cities trembled under relentless bombing campaigns. Farther east, the Soviet Union struck its own deals, seizing territory while preparing for its own survival. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japan expanded its empire through China and Southeast Asia, seeking resources and dominance. By 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States was thrust into the war, transforming it from a European conflict into a truly global struggle. But World War II was more than just armies clashing on battlefields. It was a war of technology, of ideology, and of sheer survival. Tanks and aircraft redefined mobility, submarines prowled the seas, and radar and code-breaking brought science into strategy. Entire nations became engines of war. Factories shifted from making cars to building bombers, women filled workplaces in unprecedented numbers, and propaganda fueled both morale and hatred. Civilians were no longer distant observers, they were targets, caught in the bombings of London, the firestorms of Dresden, and the atomic blasts over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The brutality of the war reached depths the world had never seen before. The Holocaust, orchestrated by the Nazi regime, systemically murdered 6 million Jews, along with millions of others deemed undesirable. This genocide, carried out with chilling bureaucracy, remains one of history's darkest stains and a reminder of the horrors unchecked hatred can unleash. On the Eastern Front, the battles between Germany and the Soviet Union became wars of annihilation, cities like Stalingrad and Leningrad enduring suffering almost beyond comprehension. The Pacific Theater, too, saw relentless brutality from the Bataan Death March to island battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where every inch of land was contested with ferocity. And yet, despite the destruction, there were moments that turned the tide. Britain's survival in the Battle of Britain, the Soviet victory at Stalingrad, and the Allied landings on the beaches of Normandy marked critical shifts. Slowly, the Axis powers were pushed back. Germany was encircled, Japan was isolated, and by 1945, the war reached its devastating conclusion. Hitler's Third Reich collapsed in ruins, Mussolini's Italy was torn apart, and Japan faced the unimaginable destruction of nuclear weapons. The war ended, but its aftermath was just as transformative as the conflict itself. Entire cities lay in rubble, millions were displaced, and the world stared at the dawn of the nuclear age. Two nations emerged from the ashes as superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, locked in a new kind of struggle. One fought not with direct armies but with ideology, espionage, and nuclear deterrence. The Cold War began, reshaping global politics for the next half-century. Borders shifted, empires crumbled, and a wave of decolonization swept across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Nations that had long lived under European rule now sought independence, inspired in part by the promises of freedom made during the war itself. The map of the world was redrawn, not just in territory but in power. Europe, once the center of global influence, now found itself divided and diminished, while new voices began to rise from every continent. The war also gave birth to institutions meant to prevent such devastation from ever happening again. The United Nations was founded with the hope of fostering diplomacy and peace, while international agreements sought to curb the spread of weapons of mass destruction. The lessons of the Holocaust pushed humanity to articulate universal human rights, laying the groundwork for modern humanitarian law. Culturally, World War II reshaped identity and memory. Stories of sacrifice, heroism, and tragedy were etched into the consciousness of nations. The war became a reference point for generations, a reminder of both the heights of courage and the depths of cruelty. It accelerated scientific discovery, leading not only to weapons but also to advancements in medicine, rocketry, and technology that would define the decades to come. From jet engines to computers, the innovations of wartime would transform peacetime. And perhaps most profoundly, the war changed how humanity saw itself. Never before had conflict been so global, so total, or so destructive. Never before had human beings held the power to annihilate entire cities with a single weapon. The aftermath forced people to question what progress really meant, what morality demanded, and how fragile civilization could be when tested by ambition and fear. When we step back and look at the great sweep of history, it becomes clear that humanity is not shaped by every battle, every invention, or every ruler. Instead, it is shaped by moments when the world tilts, when the old order collapses and a new one begins. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 closed the chapter on the medieval world and pushed Europe toward exploration and discovery. The Industrial Revolution tore humanity from the rhythms of the past and thrust us into the modern age of machines, cities, and global connections. And World War II, with its unimaginable destruction and its reshaping of nations, created the framework of the world we live in today. These turning points remind us that history is not distant or irrelevant, it is the story of how we became who we are. The struggles, the triumphs, and the choices of the past echo in every part of our lives, from the cities we live in, to the technology we use, to the politics that govern our world. By understanding these pivotal moments, we see that history is not just about what happened long ago. It is about the forces still at work around us. Forces that will one day create new turning points for future generations to study. The lesson of world history is simple yet profound. Change is inevitable, and in the smallest of moments, entire civilizations can pivot. And while we cannot predict the next turning point, we can be certain of one thing: it will come, and when it does, it will shape everything that follows.